The words hit me like a fist through the kitchen wall. Leave him, and I will give you everything you have ever wanted. I stood frozen behind that door with a grocery bag still hanging from my fingers, listening to my own mother-in-law offer my wife a fortune to walk out of our marriage, and in that single moment, the life I thought I understood cracked wide open. Before I tell you what happened next, I want to ask you something. If you believe in second chances, if you believe that even the deepest betrayals can be transformed by honesty and grace, then please take a moment right now to like this video, leave a comment, share it with someone who needs a little hope today, and subscribe to our channel. Our community grows stronger every time someone chooses to believe that people can change, and this story is proof of exactly that. My name is Nathaniel Hargrove, though everyone who knows me calls me Nate, and for 6 years I had been married to a woman named Claire Whitfield, a warm, quietly brilliant elementary school teacher with a laugh that used to make our tiny apartment feel like a cathedral. We had built our life together the slow, unglamorous way, the way most real love is built, through years of grocery budgets and second-hand furniture and late-night arguments about nothing that mattered and everything that did. We were not rich. I worked as a mid-level project manager at a logistics company in a modest suburb outside Columbus, Ohio, the kind of job that paid the bills but never made anyone's eyes widen at a dinner party. Claire's family, however, came from a different world entirely, one built on old money, private schools, and a mother named Vivien Whitfield who had never once, in 6 years, looked at me without a flicker of disappointment in her eyes. Vivien was a woman sculpted by decades of comfort and control. She had married into wealth as a young woman, and after her husband passed away, she had inherited not just his fortune but his belief that money was the only language that mattered. She lived in a sprawling colonial house on the good side of town, with white columns out front and a garden maintained by people she never bothered to learn the names of. From the very first dinner I had with the Whitfield family, I understood exactly where I stood in Vivien's eyes. She had looked me up and down like an appraiser examining a piece of furniture she had no intention of buying, and she had asked me, with a smile so polished it could have cut glass, what exactly my 5-year plan was, as though love were a business proposal that required a slide deck. Claire had always tried to shield me from her mother's coldness. She would squeeze my hand under the table during those uncomfortable dinners, she would apologize in the car afterward, she would remind me that her mother had been hurt so many times by people chasing the family fortune that she had built walls no one could climb. I believed her, because I loved her, and because for 6 years, despite Vivien's icy remarks and thinly veiled insults about my modest salary, Claire had never once wavered in her devotion to me. She had chosen me over a wealthier man her mother once tried to introduce her to. She had chosen me over the comfortable, curated life Vivien wanted for her daughter. Every time Vivien pushed, Claire pushed back, and I had always assumed that loyalty was permanent, unshakable, carved into the bones of our marriage. That belief nearly destroyed me the day I overheard the truth. It happened on an ordinary Saturday afternoon in early spring, the kind of day when sunlight pours through kitchen windows and makes even old linoleum look golden. I had gone to the store to grab ingredients for dinner, something simple, chicken and rosemary potatoes, the kind of meal Claire and I always cooked together on weekends while arguing playfully about whose turn it was to season the vegetables. When I came home, I heard Vivien's car in the driveway, an unexpected visit, since she usually announced herself with the ceremony of a foreign dignitary. I let myself in through the side door quietly, not out of any suspicion, but simply out of habit, the same way anyone slips into their own home without announcing every footstep. And that is when I heard her voice, low, deliberate, dripping with the practiced patience of a woman who had spent decades getting exactly what she wanted. Vivien was sitting at our kitchen table with Claire, and she was talking about money. Not idle chatter about investments or the stock market, but a direct, calculated offer. She told Claire that she had already spoken to her lawyer. She told Claire that if she left me, truly left me, filed the papers, walked away clean, Vivien would transfer the beach house in Hilton Head into Claire's name immediately, along with a lump sum that made my knees weak just hearing the number through a wooden door. She told Claire she could finally live the life she deserved, free of what Vivien called this smallness, free of budgeting for groceries, free of me. I stood in that hallway, grocery bag digging into my fingers, listening to Vivien methodically dismantle everything I thought was sacred, and I waited, desperately, achingly, for Claire's voice to rise in anger, for her to defend me the way she always had. Instead, there was silence. A long, suffocating silence that stretched out like a held breath before a scream. And then Claire spoke, and her voice was not angry. It was tired. It was quiet. It was the voice of someone who had been worn down by years of pressure, finally cracking under the weight of an offer too large to easily refuse. She said she needed time to think. I do not remember walking out the side door. I do not remember driving to the small park 3 streets over, the one where Claire and I used to take walks when we were newly married and couldn't afford real dates. I only remember sitting on a bench, staring at a pair of geese arguing over a scrap of bread, feeling like my entire chest had been scooped out and left empty. 6 years. 6 years of building a life, of believing in something solid, and in one afternoon I had learned that my wife was capable of considering, even for a moment, trading me for a beach house and a bank transfer. I want to pause here and tell you something important, because I know some of you watching this have felt this exact kind of heartbreak, the sudden collapse of trust in someone you thought you knew completely. It is one of the loneliest feelings in the world. It makes you question every memory, every soft moment, every declaration of love, wondering if any of it was real or if you were simply a placeholder until something better came along. If you have ever felt that way, know that you are not alone, and know that this story is not over yet, because sometimes the moments that break us are also the moments that reveal exactly who we are, and who the people around us truly are as well. I did not go home that night. I checked into a cheap motel off the highway, the kind with a flickering neon sign and a bedspread that smelled faintly of bleach, and I turned my phone off completely. I needed silence. I needed to breathe without the weight of Claire's voice replaying in my head, that tired, non-committal, I need time to think, echoing over and over like a verdict I hadn't been ready to hear. I did not cry, not that first night. I simply sat on the edge of that motel bed, staring at a blank television screen, feeling the strange numbness that comes right before real grief sets in. By morning, I had made a decision. I was not going to run. I was not going to disappear into anger or bitterness without giving Claire a chance to explain herself, because whatever I had heard, I owed us 6 years of history at least the dignity of a real conversation, not an ambush of accusations. But I also was not going to pretend I hadn't heard what I heard. I drove home just after sunrise, the streets empty and silver with early light, and I found Claire sitting at the kitchen table exactly where I had last imagined her, though of course she wasn't in the same spot at all. She was pale, her eyes red-rimmed from a sleepless night, a mug of cold coffee sitting untouched in front of her. When she saw me, she stood up so fast her chair nearly toppled, and she said my name like a question, like she wasn't sure I was really there. I told her everything. I told her I had come home early the day before, that I had heard every word through the door, that I had heard her mother's offer and I had heard her say she needed time to think. I watched her face crumble in real time, watched the color drain from it, watched her hands begin to shake. She did not deny it. She did not try to twist the story into something more palatable. Instead, she sat back down, put her face in her hands, and told me the truth in pieces, the way people do when shame makes every sentence feel like lifting something too heavy. She told me that her mother had been making these offers for years, quietly, persistently, always in private moments when I wasn't around, always framed as concern for Claire's happiness rather than outright bribery. She told me that at first she had always laughed the offers off, had always told her mother in no uncertain terms that she would never leave me for money, that our marriage wasn't for sale. But this time, she said, something had been different. Her mother had been diagnosed 6 months earlier with an early stage of a heart condition, something Claire had not told me because Vivien had begged her to keep it private, and in the wake of that diagnosis, Vivien had become obsessed with controlling everything she could still control, especially her daughter's future. The financial offer this time had come wrapped in a kind of desperate, manipulative urgency, Vivien insisting that she wanted to see Claire settled properly before anything happened to her, insisting that this was her last chance to fix what she saw as her daughter's biggest mistake. Claire told me that when she said she needed time to think, she had not meant time to think about leaving me. She had meant time to think about how to make her mother finally understand, once and for all, that this was the last conversation of its kind she would ever tolerate. She said the words had come out wrong, exhausted and defeated rather than defiant, because she had spent an entire lifetime trying to manage her mother's expectations and simply did not have the strength in that moment to fight the way she wanted to. She told me she loved me, that she had never once seriously considered leaving, that the money meant nothing to her compared to the small, ordinary life we had built, the mornings we spent making pancakes shaped like ridiculous animals for the neighbors' kids, the Sunday drives with no destination, the years of quiet, unremarkable happiness that had never once required Vivien's fortune. I wanted so badly to believe her. Part of me did believe her, even then, because I knew Claire, I knew the shape of her heart, I knew that 6 years of loyalty could not simply evaporate in one afternoon. But another part of me, the part still raw and bleeding from what I had overheard, could not simply forgive and forget in one conversation. I told her I needed space, not forever, but for a while, enough time to figure out if I could trust the foundation we had built or if it had been cracked all along without my noticing. She did not argue. She let me pack a bag and move in temporarily with my brother, Gregory, across town, and for the first time in 6 years, I slept in a bed that was not ours. The weeks that followed were some of the hardest of my life. I want to be honest with you about that, because I think too many stories skip over the messy, uncomfortable middle in favor of a quick resolution, and that does a disservice to anyone actually living through something like this. There were nights I lay awake in my brother's guest room, staring at the ceiling, wondering if I had overreacted, wondering if I had underreacted, wondering if love was ever really enough to survive the corrosive influence of people who believed money could buy loyalty. There were days I drove past our house just to see if Claire's car was in the driveway, feeling a strange, aching relief every single time it was. During that separation, something unexpected happened. Vivien, apparently unaware that I knew anything, called me directly one afternoon, her voice honeyed and falsely warm in a way that immediately put me on guard. She invited me to lunch, said she wanted to clear the air between us, and out of a strange mixture of curiosity and exhaustion, I agreed. We met at a quiet restaurant downtown, the kind with white tablecloths and a wine list longer than most novels, and over appetizers she never touched. Vivien told me she had heard Claire and I were going through a rough patch. She said this with a satisfaction she couldn't quite hide, like a chess player watching a long-planned move finally pay off. She told me that perhaps it was time I considered what was best for Claire's future, that perhaps I should be the one to end things gracefully, sparing Claire the guilt of having to choose. She even implied, delicately but unmistakably, that there would be something in it for me too if I simply walked away quietly, a generous settlement, enough money to start fresh somewhere else, no hard feelings. I sat across from that woman, this polished, wealthy matriarch who had spent 6 years treating me like an intruder in her daughter's life, and I finally understood the full scope of what I was dealing with. This was not simply a mother worried about her daughter's happiness. This was a woman who saw love as a transaction, who could not comprehend that some things were not for sale, who had spent her entire life mistaking control for care. I told her, as calmly as I could manage, that I would not be bought, that whatever happened between Claire and me would be decided by Claire and me, not by her checkbook. Vivien's smile faltered for just a moment, a crack in that polished veneer, before she recovered and told me I was making a terrible mistake, that I would regret not taking the money while it was offered. I left that restaurant with my hands shaking, not from fear, but from a strange, fierce clarity. I finally understood that my marriage had two enemies to fight, my own wounded trust, and Vivien's relentless interference, and I realized that if Claire and I were going to survive this, we would have to fight both battles together, not apart. That night, I called Claire for the first time since I had moved out. I told her about the lunch, about Vivien's offer, about the settlement she had dangled in front of me like bait. I expected Claire to be shocked, maybe even to defend her mother out of old habit, the way she sometimes did even when Vivien's behavior was indefensible. Instead, there was a long silence on the phone, and when Claire finally spoke, her voice was different than it had been in weeks, steadier, harder, the voice of someone who had finally reached the end of her patience. She told me that hearing what her mother had done, offering me money separately, behind her back, without even the decency of transparency, had broken something in her, some last thread of naive hope that her mother's controlling behavior came from a place of love rather than a place of pure manipulation. She asked me to meet her the next day, not at our house, but at the small park where we used to walk, the same park where I had sat alone the night everything fell apart. We met there under a sky so blue it almost looked unreal, sunlight scattering through new spring leaves, and Claire looked different than she had in weeks, not polished or defensive, just raw and honest in a way I hadn't seen from her in years. She told me that she had spent the last several weeks doing a lot of thinking, not about leaving me, but about her entire relationship with her mother, about the pattern of control that had shaped her whole life, about the ways she had unconsciously allowed Vivien's money and expectations to hover over our marriage like a persistent fog. She told me that she loved her mother, that she always would, that Vivien's heart condition terrified her and she couldn't simply cut her out of her life. But she also told me that she was done letting her mother treat our marriage as a bargaining chip, done letting Vivien believe that love could be purchased or dissolved with the right dollar amount. She asked me to come home. Not because everything was suddenly fixed, but because she wanted to fix it together, in the open, without secrets or silence or the quiet erosion of unspoken resentment. I want to tell you that I said yes immediately, swept up in romantic relief, but the truth is more complicated than that, and I think complicated truths are more valuable than tidy ones. I told Claire that I needed something concrete, not just words, but action. I needed her to confront her mother directly, honestly, in front of me if necessary, and set a boundary that could not be quietly dismissed the way so many boundaries had been dismissed before. I needed to know that our marriage would not spend the rest of its life being undermined by a woman who saw me as an obstacle to be removed. Claire agreed, and 2 weeks later, we drove together to Vivien's colonial house, the white columns gleaming in the afternoon sun like something out of a magazine spread, and we sat with her in that same sunlit living room where I had once been so thoroughly appraised and found wanting. Claire spoke first, and her voice did not shake. She told her mother that she loved her, that she understood her fear about the heart condition, understood the loneliness that had shaped so much of Vivien's controlling behavior over the years, but that the offer she had made, the bribe disguised as concern, had crossed a line that could never be crossed again. She told her mother that if she ever again tried to manipulate our marriage with money, ever again spoke to me privately with settlement offers or veiled threats, Claire would step back from the relationship entirely, not out of cruelty, but out of necessity, because she refused to build her marriage on a foundation her mother kept trying to dig out from underneath. Vivien's reaction surprised all three of us. I had expected anger, defensiveness, perhaps even threats of disinheritance, the kind of dramatic reaction befitting a woman used to getting her way. Instead, something in her seemed to crumble, quietly, the way old walls sometimes do, not with an explosion but with a slow, tired collapse. She began to cry, and I realized in that moment that I had never once, in 6 years, seen Vivien Whitfield cry. She told Claire, through tears that seemed to surprise even herself, that she had been so afraid, ever since the diagnosis, of dying without knowing her daughter was truly taken care of, and that somewhere along the way, her fear had twisted into control, and her control had twisted into cruelty, and she hadn't even noticed the transformation until it was staring her in the face in the form of her daughter's ultimatum. She apologized to Claire, haltingly, awkwardly, the words clearly unfamiliar in her mouth. And then, in a moment I never expected, she turned to me and apologized too, her voice small in a way that felt almost unbearable coming from a woman who had spent years making me feel small myself. I will not pretend that one emotional afternoon erased 6 years of coldness and manipulation. Healing rarely works that cleanly, and any story that tells you otherwise is selling you a fantasy rather than the truth. But something shifted that day, a door cracked open that had been sealed shut for years, and over the following months, slowly, imperfectly, Vivien began to change. She started attending therapy, something Claire later told me she never thought her mother would agree to in 100 years. She began inviting us to dinners that felt less like inspections and more like actual family gatherings. She started asking me questions about my work, not as a way of measuring my worth, but out of what seemed like genuine, if clumsy, curiosity. It was not a fairy tale transformation. There were setbacks, moments where old habits crept back in, moments where Vivien would make a comment about money or security that made Claire's jaw tighten with old frustration. But there was also, undeniably, progress, the slow unclenching of a fist that had been closed for far too long. As for Claire and me, our marriage did not simply return to what it had been before that terrible Saturday afternoon. In many ways, it became something stronger, something built on a more honest foundation than before. We started talking openly about the things we had always avoided, about Vivien's influence, about the insecurities I had quietly carried for years about not being able to give Claire the kind of life her mother thought she deserved, about the resentment Claire had quietly carried from a childhood spent being molded into someone else's idea of success. We went to a few counseling sessions together, not because our marriage was broken beyond repair, but because we both recognized that surviving a betrayal, even a betrayal born from exhaustion rather than malice, required more than just moving forward and hoping the wound would heal on its own. I remember one afternoon, almost a year after that devastating overheard conversation, sitting on our back porch with Claire, watching the late afternoon sun stretch long shadows across our small, unremarkable backyard, the same backyard Vivien had once called a starter yard, with a thinly veiled sneer. Claire took my hand and told me that she was grateful, in a strange way, for what had happened, because it had forced her to finally do something she should have done years earlier, forced her to draw a line with her mother that protected not just our marriage but her own sense of self. She told me that she had spent so many years trying to keep the peace between the two most important people in her life that she had nearly let one of them destroy the other. I told her that I understood, that I did not blame her for the years of silence, that anyone raised under the constant pressure of a parent who equated love with control might struggle to find their voice, and that what mattered most was that she had found it when it counted. I think about that overheard conversation often, the one that shattered my sense of safety in a single Saturday afternoon, and I have come to understand it differently than I did in those early raw weeks of pain. At the time, it felt like proof that my marriage was built on something fragile and false. Now I understand it as the moment that forced three people, myself, Claire, and even Vivien, to finally confront truths we had all been avoiding for years. Vivien had to confront the fact that her fear of losing control over her own mortality had curdled into an attempt to control everyone around her. Claire had to confront the fact that years of people-pleasing had left her without the tools to stand up to the person who needed standing up to the most. And I had to confront my own insecurities about money and worth, insecurities I had buried rather than examined, insecurities that had made Vivien's cruelty land so much harder than it otherwise might have. If there is one thing I hope you take from this story, it is that betrayal and heartbreak, even the kind that shakes you to your core, do not always have to be the end of the story. Sometimes they are simply the catalyst for the honest conversations we should have had years earlier. Sometimes the people who hurt us are not monsters but wounded, frightened people who have never learned a healthier way to love. That does not excuse the hurt they cause, and I want to be clear about that, because forgiveness should never mean tolerating repeated harm. But it does mean that redemption is sometimes possible, that people can change when they are finally confronted with the consequences of their actions, and that love, real love, the kind built over years of shared mournings and small sacrifices, can survive even the ugliest storms if both people are willing to fight for it honestly. Before I share how things stand today, I want to ask you something. If this story has moved you in any way, if it has reminded you of your own family struggles, your own moments of heartbreak or forgiveness, I would love for you to leave a comment below sharing what this story meant to you, or perhaps sharing a moment in your own life when you had to choose between walking away and fighting for something worth saving. Your comments mean more to our community than you know, and hearing your stories is part of what makes this channel feel like a real gathering of people who believe in second chances. Today, 3 years after that devastating Saturday afternoon, Claire and I are still together, still building our small, unremarkable, deeply happy life in that same house with the backyard Vivien once dismissed. We had a daughter last spring, a bright-eyed little girl named Josephine, and I will never forget the first time Vivien held her, tears streaming down her face, whispering promises of love that had nothing to do with money at all. Vivien is not a perfect woman. She still occasionally slips into old patterns, still occasionally makes a comment that makes Claire's shoulders tense, but she catches herself now, apologizes now, tries now, in a way she never did before. She calls just to talk, not to interrogate, not to control, and last month she asked me, unprompted, if I would help her plan her garden this spring, something I never in a million years imagined she would ask of the son-in-law she once viewed as an obstacle standing between her daughter and a proper life. Claire and I still take our walks in that same small park, the one where I once sat alone with a broken heart, the one where she once asked me to come home. We walk past that bench sometimes, and every single time, without fail, she squeezes my hand a little tighter, a silent acknowledgement of everything we survived together. I used to think that overhearing that conversation was the worst moment of my life, and in many ways, it was. But I have also come to believe that it was the moment that saved my marriage, not because it revealed some hidden betrayal, but because it forced three people trapped in years of silent tension to finally speak the truth out loud, painful as that truth was. If you have made it this far, I want to thank you for spending this time with our story, and I want to leave you with this thought. Love that is real does not disappear the moment it is tested. It bends, it breaks a little, it bleeds sometimes, but if both people are willing to fight honestly rather than simply survive quietly, it can come back stronger than it ever was before. If this story touched your heart, please take a moment to like this video, share it with someone who might need a little hope today, and subscribe to our channel so you never miss another story about kindness, forgiveness, and the second chances that make life worth living. Our family found its way back to each other, and our community here believes that yours can too, no matter what storm you might be walking through right now. Thank you for watching, and I will see you in the next story.